Los Angeles. A city of dreams where the streets shimmer under the golden California sun, hiding the struggles of those who once stood in the spotlight but have now faded into the background. Among them was Bruce Willis, a man who had once ruled Hollywood with his presence, now choosing to live a quieter, more private life away from the flashing cameras and red carpets. It had been months since he made a public appearance, his absence leaving fans wondering about his well-being. The industry had changed, and so had he. But while the world speculated, Bruce spent his days in simple moments, walking to quiet streets, observing the people, and reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. On a cold evening, as the city lights flickered like tiny stars against the concrete jungle, Bruce found himself walking alone along a less glamorous part of town. The scent of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby diner mixed with the musty air of the aging streets. The distant sound of a saxophone playing in a jazz club gave the night a melancholic charm. He had always been a man of action, but tonight he was merely an observer, watching, listening, feeling. And that was when he saw him, a homeless man, sitting on the sidewalk, wrapped in a tattered blanket that barely shielded him from the night's cold. His face was marked with time and hardship, his eyes filled with an exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. Bruce stopped. Something in the man's posture, the way he clutched an old photograph in his shaking hands, struck him deeply. He had seen faces like this before, on movie sets, in scripts filled with tragedy, in characters he had once played. But this wasn't a role. This was real. The man didn't notice him at first. He was too lost in whatever memories that photograph held. A younger version of himself, perhaps a loved one long gone. What had brought him to this place? What was his story? Bruce knew he could keep walking. That was the easiest thing to do. People passed by every day, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to see. But something held him there, something deep within, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He took a slow step forward. "Hey, buddy, you all right?" The homeless man looked up, startled. His eyes, weary and sunken, met Bruce's. And in that instant, something shifted. Neither of them knew that this moment, this simple act of stopping, of acknowledging, would set off a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. Because sometimes, the smallest moments lead to the greatest changes. Have you ever passed by someone and wonder what their story was? What would you do in Bruce's place? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched you, give it a like and help us spread this message. Join our community, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories like this one. For a brief moment, silence hung between them. The bustling noise of Los Angeles, the honking cars, the distant sirens, the murmurs of people passing by, felt strangely muted as Bruce Willis and the homeless man locked eyes. The man hesitated, his fingers tightening around the worn-out photograph in his hands. He wasn't used to being noticed. Most people walked past him as if he didn't exist. Bruce, sensing the man's hesitation, took a step closer but remained cautious, not wanting to invade his space. "Can I sit?" Bruce asked, his voice calm, steady. The man looked at him, his lips parting slightly as if to respond, but no words came out. Finally, with a small nod, he gestured toward the curb beside him. Bruce lowered himself down, feeling the rough pavement beneath him. The coldness seeped through his jacket, but he ignored it. He wasn't here out of pity. He was here because something about this man called to him. "What's your name?" Bruce asked. The man exhaled a slow breath, his eyes still studying him, unsure if he should answer. "Daniel," he finally muttered. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Bruce nodded, letting the name settle in the air between them. "You from around here?" he asked. Daniel let out a soft chuckle, dry, almost bitter. "I used to be," he said, "a long time ago." He glanced down at the photograph in his hands, his fingers brushing over it as if it were the last fragile piece of his past. Bruce followed his gaze. "Who's in the picture?" he asked gently. Daniel hesitated, but something about Bruce's presence felt safe. He turned the photograph slightly, allowing Bruce a glimpse. It was an old black and white photo of a younger man in a military uniform, standing next to a woman holding a small child. The edges of the picture were frayed, worn by time and hardship. Bruce studied the image carefully. The man in the uniform, was that Daniel? You were in the military? Bruce asked, his tone carrying both respect and curiosity. Daniel gave a slow nod. Yeah, a lifetime ago, he murmured. His thumb ran over the face of the woman in the picture. That's my wife and my son. Bruce felt a tightness in his chest. There was so much pain behind those words. What happened? Daniel sighed deeply, his body almost folding in on itself as if the weight of the past had suddenly become unbearable. Life, he said simply. Bruce didn't push. He knew some wounds couldn't be rushed open. Instead, he just sat there, letting Daniel hold on to his silence. And in that moment, something shifted. For the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't invisible. Someone was listening, and that alone was more powerful than words. Bruce sat there, his hands resting on his knees, waiting. He had learned that sometimes silence was more powerful than words, that giving someone the space to speak on their own terms was more valuable than trying to fill the gaps. Daniel stared at the old photograph in his weathered hands, his eyes distant, lost in time. His lips trembled slightly, as if forming words was a struggle, as if he were afraid that saying them aloud would make them real again. You ever feel like life just slipped through your fingers? He asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Bruce remained quiet, allowing Daniel to continue. I had everything once, Daniel said, his gaze never leaving the photo. A family, a home, a future. He swallowed hard. Then one decision, one mistake, and it was all gone. The weight of his words settled between them like an invisible storm. Bruce finally spoke, his voice low, careful. What happened? Daniel took a shaky breath, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm himself from a cold that wasn't just in the air, but deep in his bones. I served in the Marines, he said. Did 2 tours. When I got back, I wasn't the same. He forced a small, hollow laugh. At first, I thought I was fine. Everyone thought I was fine. Bruce knew where this was going. He had seen it before. Stories of men who had given everything for their country, only to return home as strangers in their own lives. But I wasn't, Daniel admitted. The nightmares, the anxiety, I started drinking. Not just a little. Enough to numb everything. Enough to make me forget. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. My wife tried to help, he continued, his voice cracking. She really did. But I pushed her away. I pushed everyone away. Bruce could see the pain in his face, the guilt that had long since settled into his bones, the regret that came with every waking moment. One night, Daniel said, his voice breaking, I lost control. I said things I could never take back. I left, walked out the door, and never turned back. A long pause. And now, Bruce asked, his voice softer now, have you tried finding them? Daniel let out a slow, bitter breath. They moved on, he said, and I don't blame them. His fingers traced the image of his wife in the photo. Last I heard, my son's in college now. Probably doesn't even remember me. A painful silence stretched between them. Bruce felt a deep ache in his chest. He knew loss. He knew regret. But he also knew that some things weren't as broken as they seemed. Maybe it's not too late, Bruce said carefully. Daniel shook his head. I wouldn't even know where to start, he admitted. Bruce looked at him for a long moment before responding. Sometimes all it takes is a first step. Daniel let out a small, tired chuckle, shaking his head. You make it sound so easy. Bruce offered a small smile. It's not, he admitted, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. Daniel said nothing, but something in his expression shifted. Something almost imperceptible. For the first time in years, he wasn't just thinking about his past. He was thinking about what came next. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the crisp night air. His hands, still gripping the old photograph, trembled slightly, not just from the cold, but from the weight of everything he had just shared. Bruce remained silent for a moment, letting Daniel's words settle. He could feel the pain radiating from the man beside him, the kind of pain that lingers, that makes you believe you're beyond saving. But Bruce had seen enough in his lifetime to know that sometimes All it took was one person who refused to look away. "You hungry?" Bruce asked suddenly. Daniel blinked, as if startled by the simplicity of the question. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah, I guess." Bruce pushed himself up on the cold pavement, dusting off his jacket before extending a hand toward Daniel. "Come on," he said. "I know a place." Daniel hesitated again. It had been a long time since someone had offered him anything other than a sideways glance or a muttered apology before walking away. But Bruce wasn't walking away. With a small nod, Daniel reached out, his rough, callous hand gripping Bruce's. It had been years since he had shaken hands with another man without feeling invisible. Bruce led him down the dimly lit street, past neon signs flickering above old diners and corner stores. The city smelled of gasoline and fried food, a mixture of life and exhaustion wrapped into one. They arrived at a small, cozy diner, a relic of old Hollywood, where the jukebox still worked and the waitresses called you darling no matter who you were. As they stepped inside, warmth enveloped them. The scent of fresh coffee and buttered toast filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold night outside. A waitress, middle-aged with kind eyes, approached with a smile. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, addressing Bruce as if he were an old friend. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy," Bruce replied with a grin, then gestured toward Daniel. "Got a friend with me tonight." The woman glanced at Daniel, taking in his worn-out clothes and tired eyes. There was no judgment in her gaze, only curiosity. "You boys take a seat," she said, leading them to a booth by the window. "First cup of coffee's on me." Daniel slid into the seat across from Bruce, his fingers instinctively wrapping around the warm ceramic mug the waitress placed in front of him. He stared at the dark liquid for a long time before finally taking a sip. It was just coffee, nothing fancy. But to Daniel, it tasted like something he hadn't felt in years. Dignity. Bruce watched him, sensing the shift. "Good?" he asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, almost to himself. "It is." Bruce leaned forward, his expression serious now. "You said you don't know where to start," he said. "Maybe this is it." Daniel looked up, meeting his gaze. For the first time in a long time, the idea of a new beginning didn't feel like an impossible dream. The diner was warm, almost too warm for someone who had spent years sleeping under the open sky. Daniel loosened the ragged scarf around his neck, feeling the unfamiliar comfort settle into his bones. Bruce sat across from him, casually stirring his coffee, as if this was just a normal evening between old friends. But Daniel knew better. Nothing about his life had been normal for a long time. "You always bring strangers to dinner?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with both amusement and skepticism. Bruce smirked. "Only the interesting ones." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you must be crazy." Bruce took a sip of his coffee before responding. "Maybe, or maybe I just know what it's like to feel lost." Something in the way he said it made Daniel pause. He had always seen Bruce Willis as a guy who had it all. Fame, fortune, a life people envied. But now, looking at him, he saw something else. A quiet understanding, a recognition of pain. "Look, I get it," Bruce continued. "You've been out here for a long time. It's not easy to just flip a switch and change everything overnight." Daniel let out a slow breath. "You have no idea." Bruce leaned back, studying him. "Then tell me." Daniel hesitated. No one ever asked. No one ever wanted to hear. But here was Bruce Willis, a Hollywood legend, sitting across from him, waiting, actually waiting, to listen. He looked down at his hands, tracing the cracks in his skin, the scars of a life that had unraveled long ago. "I used to tell myself that one day I'd fix it," he admitted. "That I'd go back, make things right." Bruce nodded, waiting. "But the longer you stay down, the harder it is to climb back up," Daniel continued. "You start telling yourself it's too late, that even if you tried, no one would want you back." He clenched his jaw, his eyes darkening with the weight of his thoughts. "You think your son wouldn't want you back?" Bruce asked carefully. Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't know," he whispered. "Maybe he'd be better off never knowing me." Bruce set his coffee down, leaning forward slightly. "Or Maybe he's out there wondering about you, wondering why you never tried. The words hit Daniel like a gut punch. He had spent so many years drowning in guilt, convinced that his family was better off without him. But what if he was wrong? What if his son was waiting for him to come back? The thought sent a ripple of something unexpected through him. Hope. But hope was dangerous. Hope made you want things you weren't sure you deserved. Even if I wanted to, Daniel said, shaking his head, I wouldn't even know how to start. Bruce studied him for a long moment before pulling something out of his jacket pocket. A cell phone. You start by making a call, Bruce said, sliding the phone across the table. Daniel stared at it, his pulse quickening. It was so simple. Too simple. He reached out, but stopped just short of touching it, his hands hovering over the device as if it were a weapon rather than a lifeline. His past, his mistakes, his fears. They were all screaming at him to turn away. But for the first time in years, another voice, a softer voice, whispered something else. What if? Daniel swallowed hard. This was it. The moment where everything could change. But would he take it? The phone lay on the table between them. A simple object, yet it felt heavier than anything Daniel had ever lifted. His fingers hovered over it, trembling slightly. Bruce didn't push. He simply watched, waiting. What's stopping you? He asked after a moment. Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen. Everything, he admitted. He could already hear the possible responses in his head. It's too late, Dad. I don't need you anymore. We moved on. And maybe that was the truth. Maybe they had moved on. Maybe there was no space left for him in their lives. I spent so many years running from this, Daniel murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. How do I just walk back into their lives like nothing happened? You don't, Bruce said plainly. You walk back in knowing you screwed up, but willing to fix it. Daniel let out a bitter chuckle. And what if they don't want that? Bruce shrugged. Then at least you'll know. But what if they do? That thought had haunted Daniel for years. The possibility that his son might still want to hear his voice, that his wife might still remember the man he was before the darkness took over. But it also terrified him. Man, I don't even know what to say, Daniel admitted. Bruce leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Say what's real. Say what you wish someone had told you when you were at your lowest. Daniel swallowed hard. He reached out, his fingers finally brushing against the cold surface of the phone. His heart pounded in his chest as he picked it up, his thumb hovering over the screen. For years, he had convinced himself that this moment would never come, that the damage was done, irreversible. But what if he had been wrong? He took a shaky breath, his pulse hammering in his ears, and slowly typed the number he still remembered by heart. His thumb lingered over the call button. Bruce watched him carefully. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this. Daniel glanced up, his eyes filled with something fragile, something that had almost disappeared completely. Hope. His thumb pressed down. The phone rang once, twice, and then a click, a voice. Hello. Daniel's throat tightened. He opened his mouth, but for a split second, nothing came out. And then, finally, hey, kid, silence. Then, a sharp inhale on the other end. And suddenly, everything was real. Have you ever reached out to someone after years apart? How did it go? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It helps us create more inspiring stories like this one. Subscribe and be part of our community that believes in second chances and the power of reconnecting. Daniel gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the sounds of the diner around him. Hello. The voice on the other end was deeper than he remembered, no longer the child he once knew. But it was him, his son. Daniel tried to speak, but his throat was tight, his mind racing. He had played out the scenario 1,000 times in his head, but now, faced with reality, words failed him. For a moment, all he could do was breathe. Dad. The word hit him like a shockwave. It wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was hesitant, unsure, but it was there. Daniel swallowed hard, blinking against a sudden sting in his eyes. Yeah, it's me, he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. There was silence on the other end. Then, a shaky exhale. I don't know what to say, his son admitted. Daniel let out a small, breathless laugh. Me neither, he confessed. Another pause. A long one. Daniel held his breath, afraid that at any moment the call would end, that the silence would stretch into nothingness. But it didn't. "You alive?" his son asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Yeah," Daniel whispered. "I am." A deep inhale came from the other end, followed by a quieter, almost fragile, "I thought you were gone." Daniel closed his eyes for a second, the weight of those words crushing him. "I was," he admitted, "for a long time." His son said nothing, but Daniel could feel the emotions between them. The years of distance, the pain, the unanswered questions. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Daniel continued, forcing himself to say the words he'd been too afraid to voice. "I don't even know if I deserve to ask for that." His hands trembled slightly as he pressed on. I needed to hear your voice, to know if you were okay." A sniffle came from the other end of the line. "I'm okay," his son said, but his voice wavered. Daniel let out a slow breath, one he felt like he had been holding for years. "Good," he said softly. "That's all I needed to know." Silence again. But this time it wasn't empty. It wasn't cold. It was filled with something else. Something unspoken. Something unfinished. Bruce, who had been watching the entire time, leaned forward slightly, sensing the weight of the moment. Daniel could feel the walls of his past still standing between him and his son. But now, there was a door, slightly open, not closed forever. And for the first time in years, he dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the story. Daniel slowly lowered the phone, his fingers still curled around it, as if letting go would make the moment disappear. He stared at the screen, the call now ended, but the words still echoing in his mind. "I thought you were gone." He blinked, swallowing hard. He had imagined this moment for years, feared it, avoided it, and yet it had happened, and his son hadn't hung up on him. That alone was something he never thought possible. Across the table, Bruce watched him carefully. He didn't ask what was said. He didn't need to. "How do you feel?" Bruce finally asked. Daniel exhaled shakily, setting the phone down. "Like I just ran a marathon without moving." Bruce smirked. "Sounds about right." Daniel let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't know what happens next." "You don't have to," Bruce said. "You just have to know that there is a next." Daniel looked up, meeting Bruce's gaze. "You really believe that?" Bruce leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "I've been in this business a long time," he said. "And if there's one thing I know about stories, it's that the best ones always have a second act." Daniel let the words sink in. For years, he had convinced himself that his story was over, that he was nothing more than a footnote in the lives of the people he had left behind. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't true. Bruce glanced at the phone. He picked up, didn't he? Daniel nodded slowly. "That means the door was never fully closed," Bruce said. "You just have to decide whether you want to step through it." Daniel sat there, feeling the weight of those words. He had spent so much time punishing himself for the past that he had never let himself imagine a future. Now, for the first time in years, he could see it. It wasn't clear. It wasn't guaranteed. But it was there, a possibility, a chance. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The night outside had grown colder, but inside the diner, the warmth lingered. Daniel sat in silence, his mind replaying the conversation with his son over and over, dissecting every word, every pause, every breath. He had expected rejection. He had expected anger. Instead, he got something he wasn't prepared for, a chance. But now that he had it, he wasn't sure what to do next. Bruce watched him closely, letting him sit with his thoughts before finally breaking the silence. "You thinking about calling him again?" Daniel's fingers tapped against the rim of his coffee mug. "I don't know," he admitted. "What if this was a one-time thing? What if he regrets picking up?" Bruce chuckled softly. "You ever notice how we always assume the worst?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. Bruce leaned back, stretching his arms. "You're sitting here running through a million bad scenarios in your head. But what if, for once, You tried thinking about the good ones. Daniel scoffed. Easier said than done. Bruce nodded. Yeah, but not impossible. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't even know how to be a father anymore. Bruce studied him for a moment. Maybe you don't have to know everything right away. Maybe you just have to show up. Daniel let those words sink in. For years, he had believed that being a father meant having all the answers, being strong, never failing. But the truth was, he had already failed in the worst way. He had left. And yet, his son had answered the phone. That meant something. I wouldn't even know what to say to him, Daniel admitted, his voice quieter now. Bruce smirked. You already said the most important thing. You came back. Daniel looked down, processing those words. You think that's enough? Bruce held his gaze. It's a start. A start. Daniel had never let himself believe in one before. But now, sitting across from a man who had nothing to gain from helping him, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. And maybe he wasn't alone anymore. Daniel sat in the diner, staring at the phone on the table. The screen was dark now, but in his mind it was still lit up, still ringing, still holding the voice of a son he thought he had lost forever. For years he had convinced himself that this moment would never come, that his past mistakes had sealed his fate, that the bridges he burned could never be rebuilt. And yet, here he was. The door wasn't closed. Not yet. Bruce watched him, his expression calm, but expectant. You ready? Daniel furrowed his brow. Ready for what? Bruce smirked, pushing the phone toward him again. You got through the first call, Bruce said. Now it's time for the second. Daniel's stomach tightened. You think I should just call again? Like that? Bruce shrugged. I think you should stop waiting for the perfect moment. It doesn't exist. Daniel let out a breath, staring down at the phone. He could hear the voice of his son in his head, the hesitance, the uncertainty, but also the fact that he hadn't pushed him away. That had to mean something. He picked up the phone, his fingers tracing the edges. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what would happen next. But maybe that was okay. Maybe all that mattered was that he was here, trying, showing up. Bruce nodded toward him. Whenever you're ready. Daniel looked at the screen one more time. And then he dialed. The phone rang. Once. Twice. This time, when the voice on the other end answered, it didn't sound hesitant. Hey, Dad. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he was holding. A second chance. A step forward. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in something again. Hope.